Yeah.
So just a little color on the background on how you and I met. Early on in my days of I-9, the only thing I had going for me was franchise sales. Everything else was kind of a mess. Infrastructure-wise, staffing was a little bit of a mess. Franchisee consistency of running the operation was a bit bit of a mess. We didn't have much of a marketing plan. And so I go to Hollywood, Florida. I go to an IFA event, and you were one of the speakers there. And the topic you were talking about, if you recall, was franchise sales. The one thing I had actually working well. I go
Not
sitting
much one
in.
trick pony. Yeah. Yeah.
So I go sitting in this franchise sales discussion. The one thing I have working for me, at the end of the event, I'll never forget. You were a stranger to me, but I was totally bought into what you were telling us as a group. I knew that you were an expert in the industry, and I think I grabbed you and Joe, and I said, Joe, I know we haven't met yet. My name is Frank Fiume. I'm a founder of a young company called I9 Sports, and we're going out of business fast. I need your help.
It's pretty much how the conversation.
So why don't you share a little bit about your background, though, in franchising and how you even got there, because you have quite the colorful franchise background.
I did. I got to go all the way back to the beginning. So, 1985, I was an art major in college. And in my junior year, I drew a picture. I looked at it. I just said, yeah, what are you kidding? I didn't want to be the struggling, poor, poverty sidewalk artist. So I did the hurry up offense and got my degree in marketing. But the reason I talk about art is because at my core, I would say that's who I am. Our artists look at things through a particular vantage point, which I'll get into in a second. And then I learned business and business as another vantage point. So when I look at problems in franchising, I have two set of prisms, and that's kind of helped me succeed. Artists have a really good idea of, they don't take their eye off the whole. So they would say the whole is actually different than more than the sum of the parts. In other words, you can't describe a Van Gogh in the form of, it's just a bunch of little brush strokes, right?
Right.
Added up, right? No, the whole is different than the sum of the parts. I find that in franchising in particular, that the brand, right, is different than the sum of the parts of the players. So that art background really helped me from a vantage point. And then business people, we're all reductionists, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what's the problem? How do you reduce it down to its key, simplest components and then get it done? But the assumption there is the business, right,
Mm-hmm.
is the sum of its parts, right?
Absolutely.
So, so I think you need both in franchising, but I think the reductionist philosophy is what's prevalent, and the Gestalt philosophy, or the whole, is different, sort of bigger than the sum of the parts. Right. I think we need more of in franchising. I think one eye has to be on brand.
Absolutely. So you get started with this little company in Connecticut. You become part of, what's the name of that brand? Did they ever get anywhere?
Yeah. So I went to the next town over, the New Haven Register, when there was a such thing, Frank, as newspapers, right? I look it in there and I'm trying to find where I'm going to work, apply all this vast marketing experience that I don't have. Right? And I read a little story about it, the local sandwich chain that wants to be bigger than McDonald's. They had a couple hundred units. They got 300 units. They're making a good run.
Okay.
They're in about 17 states. So I went down there with my little resume and I said, here, I'm a marketer. Do you need marketing? And they said, you want to sell franchises? And I said, sure. What's a franchise? Well, a franchise is a distribution strategy, leveraging the skills of entrepreneurs. That was your training program. And can you start tomorrow? And I said, sure, fine. And it was Subway.
Oh,
right.
Subway.
So I was their third recruiter. The first recruiter had been there about 2 years. The second was there a month before me. And then I was number 3. And there was only 40 employees in the whole building.
Wow.
So I knew Fred DeLuca when he was only a millionaire, right? His office was over here, like around the corner from my QB.
Okay.
But what I got, I have no entrepreneurship in my family history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I got out of it was right away, after about 30 days, where people don't want to franchise, they want their lives to look a particular way, right?
Right.
And if they could find it in the job market, they would, because it's lower risk, right? I just saw I wasn't really selling franchise. I was delivering really deep, committed personal objectives with the highest degree of probability if people did business with me. So where am I going to get this? I'll never see this again. So 30 days into my job, I said, that's all I'm ever going to do. And now we fast forward almost 40 years, Frank. It's all I've ever done.
Wow. Having that background of being part of Subway early on, you got to see things that people would never get to experience. I mean, talk about on-the-job training, right?
It was, I mean, there was no track to run on other than McDonald's, right? So we were
Right.
figuring it out as we go. What I saw more than anything is what's the impact on a brand when you inject entrepreneurship into it and just let the entrepreneur be the entrepreneur. Like, you can't predict this. I don't even think Fred DeLuca, he could predict the size of it. I don't think he could have predicted what he really did. You know, if you look at what Fred DeLuca really did in franchise, not only did he change the way the world eats, that's the given. How many smaller, lower entry cost franchising and food and every other sector started because DeLuca started Subway?
Yeah, true. The ripple effect.
He's probably the most important and most impactful person in the history of franchise. Way more impactful, in my opinion, than Ray Kroc.
Wow.
You know, they have always had one eye on Subway. If Subway could do it, because it's meat between two slices of bread,
right?
You know, then I could do it too.
Right. Yeah. And just share real quick about Fred's vision that when you were an employee, he had this crazy aspiration that you all thought was absolute insanity.
Well, what he said, okay, was we are going to be bigger than McDonald's. Like, it was a magnificent obsession. I think it was a little misguided in the sense that, right, it wasn't about franchisee profitability. It wasn't about franchise. It was, we're going to be bigger than McDonald's, right? But my first box of business cards at 400 units said 5,000 units within a 9-year period. And the big joke was, when are we going to get new business cards? Because that level of growth, if it took us 20 years to get to 400, what's the likelihood, over the next 9 years, we're going to get to 5,000, except that he beat it by 3 years.
Oh, wow.
He did it in 6. He did it in 6 years. So he just built the whole, I was there when the thing tipped. That's the other thing about franchising I learned is I knew what a tipping point looks like, because I was right at the elbow, right? When I got in at the elbow of the hockey stick and watched it fly.
Okay.
So I do see that with every national brand, they all hit a tipping point when they were emerging growth, which is your conversation, right?
Well, yeah. So what takes people to that tipping point? And so many don't get there, right? 84% of all franchisors don't even get to 100 units. Over your experience, Joe, how do they get to that?
So first thing I think I learned about franchise, which is key, and you know this being a franchisor, is that franchising is a business unto itself.
Right.
Right. So you've got to be masterful in two models. So you got to be masterful in the consumer-facing model, which I thought you were in I-9. I think like when I got into I-9, you really knew how to read market demand. And I think you were working on the delivery, but you heard the market, right?
Right.
So one would be the consumer-facing model. And then second is you got to be brilliant as a franchisor, which is a separate and distinct business than the consumer-facing model. So it's funny, if you read even the definition of the franchisor, Frank, it talks about an agreement between an entrepreneur or a license between an entrepreneur and a brand to do business, right? So we don't even have good definitions about what, because I would say that's the last thing a franchisor is a license, right?
Right.
Exactly. Or a franchise is a license, because they don't get legal when they're not working. They don't get legal when they're working, right? So we, in our company, we define franchising as recruiting, training, developing, resourcing, and leading a team of entrepreneurs to build a brand. So notice what's missing from that definition, because I saw you nod, and you must agree with the definition on some level, right?
Absolutely.
What's missing from that definition is what's the product, right?
Right, exactly. What are we selling?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Right, so now, can you recruit? Can you train? Can you develop? And can you lead a team of entrepreneurs who can work together to build a brand? I think I've worked every industry in franchising except for hotels, because I stay in franchising, which is how I defined it.
Let's start with that first step. Let's talk about recruiting, since that's, of course, if you don't recruit, you don't have a franchise system, right, initially. Is that not the expertise of your business, of the Franchise Performance Group?
Yeah,
right?
That's where I spend most of my time.
Yeah, so
I'm pretty well-rounded, but I would say I'm best known in franchisee recruitment.
So let's talk about today. What's going on in franchise recruitment?
So I think we're back to the old philosophy of sales. I think, so if you're asking me, like, go back to the definition of franchise, would be recruiting, right? So I see the front part of that as talent acquisition, like who you putting on your team. But if you go to these events, we're back to sales speak. We're back to, I think, putting sales guys in those roles And we're back to looking at, building the brand as a transaction, instead of a match, right, between capital, aptitudes, and skills, and applying that to the role of the franchisee in the business as a predictor of success.
Wow.
I think we really I think we're going backwards as it relates to that, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Why did that happen? How could that happen?
I think there's, number one, I think there's a supply and demand disequilibrium, right? We talk about there was a question I didn't fully answer, which is why are there so many emerging growth franchisors that don't make it Trump, right?
Right.
So, Frank, do you know how many new business starts there were in 2022?
How many?
5 million. 5 million applications for new businesses. Do you know how many new franchise starts there were? About 28,000, maybe 29,000. That would include existing franchisees expanding within the same system, right? So let's assume nobody really knows, but let's assume it's half a development as existing franchisees expanding organically because it's a successful brand. That's what it would be, right? That means there's only about 15,000 new franchisees a year, right? Coming into business. 80% of them buy a business or buy a brand of 100 or more units, right? So in other words, they want the established brands. They don't want the new guys. They don't want the emerging growth guys, right? So that leaves, if you look, if there's 4,000 brands, and let's call it 80%, which is a little more than that, don't get to 100 units. You math it out. That means there's about 3,200, 3,300 brands going after 3,000 to 4,000 new franchisees that will buy an emerging growth brand. That's one per brand.
Wow.
The numbers don't work.
Right.
The numbers flat out don't work, right? In any market, economics 101, right? When there's more demand than there's supply, what happens to price? So how many franchisors are lowering their franchise fees? How many are rolling their royalties? They're going up, right? So they can work with the brokers. So they're actually raising fees. The construction costs everything's going up, right? So it's completely ass backwards, which is, they're not looking out there. They should be consumed with, how do we de-risk the model? How do we incentivize growth? How do we lower the front end? And for an emerging growth franchisor, if you look at the numbers, because we'll probably get into exit values at some point in this conversation, right? If you look at the exit values at emerging growth, that franchisee is worth more to the franchisor than the franchisor is worth to that franchisee, in my humble opinion, often, right? They should be incentivizing these guys to come in, right? But it's not occurring at any meaningful level.
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fiume, or Emerging Franchise Group, LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its host do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.